welcome. My name is Charlie Chung with NovoEd, and welcome to the webinar today. The webinar is on the topic of leveraging learning to build a customer-centric culture. First, a few housekeeping items, and I want to let you know that you've got your audio is on mute, but that you can ask questions at any time through the GoToWebinar panel. You can enter in questions there. Please let us know if you're having any technical difficulties, and ask us questions throughout the webinar, and at specific points we'll stop and address some of those questions. We do have a survey at the end of the webinar, a very quick few question survey. We'd love to have you answer that so that we can continue to provide high quality content for you. And also want to let everyone know that this webinar is being recorded. We will share the recording of the webinar for future reference and send that to you in an email. So quick introductions. I'm Charlie. I'm the Director of Solutions at NovoEd. I work with a lot of NovoEd customers, partners, and prospective customers, really looking at a lot of different use cases around online learning and online training. We have as our guest and our speaker today, Erina Streeter from Forrester. Let me tell you a little bit about Erin. She's a design-minded business leader who creates value for companies by developing, launching, and managing products that solve customer problems in new ways. Erin joined Forrester in January of 2008. She leads Forrester's fast-growing learning business unit, which accelerates client companies' critical business transformations with training and certification programs. Previously, Erin led operations and innovation for Forrester's Leadership Boards product, where she helped to build a centralized, efficient organization with a culture of high performance and introduce new digital experiences, including a peer community. Her past experience also includes leadership roles with several of Forrester's peer councils, including the CX Council, Application Development Delivery Council, and the CMO Group. Now, I'll hand it over to Erin in just a moment, but before I do, let me give a brief introduction to NovoEd for those of you who are not familiar with us. We were founded 7 years ago at Stanford University, focused on building effective, engaging online learning experiences and facilitating the creation of those experiences through our award-winning platform. It incorporates social learning algorithms and research that was developed at the university in order to help provide real learning to help large and small organizations and their learners. We've served over thousands of courses, had well over 1 million learners from large organizations, nonprofits, universities, consulting and training firms, really across the spectrum with online and blended online courses. Our platform is really focused on helping to power experiential learning and to support the development of skills that really matter. And I would like to say that I'm very, very pleased to have Erin join us for this webinar and talk about some of the great work that Forrester is doing in this really hot area of customer experience. And so she'll talk a little bit about what that is, what that customer experience trend is, what CX transformation is about, and how learning plays a critical role in that. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Erina Streeter from Forrester.
Thanks, Charlie. And I'm just going to transition screens here so we can start with a quick poll that's designed to help us understand a little bit more about the vantage point that you're each coming from today. So are you able to see my screen for folks on the NovoEd team? I just want to make sure that that's coming through.
Yes, but we don't see it in presentation mode quite yet.
Okay, apologies, folks. I have 2 monitors going here, so let me get you the right one. All right.
Yes, that looks perfect.
All right, great. Sorry for that, folks. So you should have a poll that's popping up here. And again, this is to understand the vantage point that you're coming from. So we'd like to know which of these options best describes your organization's current approach to customer experience. And the last option is one that may be valid for you in terms of not being sure, which is perfectly fine. But for those of you who have a perspective on this, we'd like to know if customer experience is something that's not that important to your organization right now, B, whether it's a nice to have that can sometimes fall by the wayside, C, it might be an area of focus, but not necessarily a formal initiative. And D, it's a strategic imperative mandated by your executive leadership. So in other words, everyone knows that this is a major area of focus for the company. So if you can go ahead and let us know where you're coming from, that will be great context for our conversation today. Okay. So while you let us know where you stand, and it looks like we have the results that are kind of coming in on a rolling basis, and for a lot of you, it looks like customer experience is actually a strategic imperative, which is great for today's conversation. We'll love to hear your perspectives on that. So let's dive in, and as those results come in, we can reflect back on those as we go. So our quick agenda for today, we want to walk you through, the CX transformation imperative as it's clear to Forrester in our research that we do on a really broad basis in the marketplace. And then next, talk about how learning is a really critical and crucial lever in a transformation, like becoming more customer-centric or focusing on customer experience as a way to differentiate. Yeah, Charlie.
Hey, Erin. We still see the poll on your screen, so you may need to switch windows to make sure you're showing your PowerPoint.
I apologize about that.
You may want to click off. Yep.
Okay. Are you now seeing my slides?
Yeah, there we go. We see the agenda there.
All right, great. All right, see the agenda I was just voicing over. And lastly, we'll talk about Forrester's approach to learning, which we've adopted really based on what our research tells us we need to do to be effective, to have learning be an effective part of customer experience, enablement, and culture change. So in Forrester's view, CX is not a trend. It's actually part of a 20-year business cycle that we call the age of the customer. And the way that we talk about this is in the context of empowered customers that are really reshaping the way that companies compete. And my guess is that so many of you are saying that CX is a strategic imperative that's got executive focus, that you're already feeling this in your organizations. So we know that power has shifted from institutions to customers. So some of those traditional sources of competitive advantage, for example, your supply chain, those things have kind of eroded in the face of digital disruption. And so companies find themselves faced with this dilemma of either having to adapt and find a way to capitalize on this new dynamic, or really fall by the wayside in the process. So what we are in the business of doing is helping companies to capitalize on the opportunity and avoid, the risks that come along with this new dynamic that we're all competing in. And what we see time and time again in our research is that companies that actually succeed in making CX a strategic focus, in differentiating on customer experience in the marketplace, actually win in terms of revenue growth, in terms of profitability. And to demonstrate that point, I just wanted to walk you through one of the many examples that we use in our research of a company that has successfully done this and give you a little bit of insight into how. So in this case, we're talking about HP and in particular, their printer business. So a few years ago, HP actually split between HP Enterprise, which had the advantage of being in the business of cloud and software as a service products, and their HP printer business, which we all know as the more familiar image that you see here on the screen. And so HP, the printer business, the personal systems and computing business, really found itself in a conundrum and facing some really important questions about how they would continue to compete, how they would differentiate in a really crowded and commoditized marketplace. So, just a couple of things they were up against in terms of industry maturity, right? We all print less in this digital age that we're in. They also are a very product-centric company. So versus customer-centric, which is what we're talking about today, when you're product-centric, you tend to focus on features, functionality, feeds and speeds, and kind of designing the next best printer, whether or not it's aligned to the needs of customers and how those needs are changing. And then the third complication, which is probably a familiar one to a lot of you, is having really siloed ways of working. So when you're not organized around customer needs or organized around a common understanding of the customer, you can find yourself kind of doing repetitive work, creating additional costs that you don't need to, and otherwise working in an uncoordinated way that leads to uncoordinated product experiences. So the point that we're making here is that they're really missing an opportunity and actually causing harm where customers at those critical moments, which we've all experienced, when you're unboxing or setting up a new HP product, that experience was feeling pretty disjointed. So it was reflecting all of those complications that you see on the screen. And so what they did over the course of a multi-year journey, and for those of you who are in the midst of this right now, you can appreciate kind of the scope and magnitude and time required to actually make a transition like this. But some of the things that they did along that road included uncovering ways that they could delight the customer while simultaneously saving costs. So that's a much easier, it's a much easier sell. It's a much easier way to get executive buy-in when you think about customer experience as a means to not only save costs, but to create this customer experience differentiation that's going to drive further growth. So first and foremost, they actually aligned on definitions of who their customers are and what they mean by customer experience. So in other words, what are those customers' expectations at each of those critical points that they interact with HP as a brand? And you can do that through tools like the visual that we see on the screen here, a journey map that actually points out all the different steps that a customer goes through, the things that they're expecting, feeling, and thinking at each of those steps along the way. So aligning all of their employees around those customer expectations helps them design more effective products and solutions. Also important to this journey is governance that made CX everyone's responsibility and also help to facilitate collaboration. So again, kind of breaking down some of those silos when you're united around solving a customer problem rather than designing the next, fastest version of your component. And lastly, they put in place a lot of standardization and repeatability that generated some of those efficiencies for cost savings, but were also good for the customer in the fact that they were able to deliver more consistent, more predictable customer experiences as a matter of doing business and not as a matter of happenstance. So obviously, it's a very quick summary of what I described as a multi-year journey. But the key results are really what probably all of your organizations are after, which are, more successful product launches, less dependency on vendors, fewer redundancies, as well as mistakes. And then lastly, kind of the business outcome that all of our client companies are seeking, and I'm sure is true in your organizations, that they actually saw huge cost savings and an increase in revenue, all driven by this customer-focused culture that they were able to establish over time. So I illustrate that again, just as a quick example of what a transformation of this scale kind of looks like in practice and what the results are that we see time and time again in these companies that we study who've done this successfully. So with all of that research, we describe customer experience as a revenue growth method, as a way to grow profitability in a way that is superior given today's market conditions. So when you get customer experience right, you actually influence loyalty behaviors like retention, like enrichment, like advocacy. So is someone going to actually recommend your product or service to a contact of theirs, which all drive business growth. And Forrester has a proprietary index, we call it the Customer Experience Index, that we use to actually measure companies' customer experience. And we can tie that, empirically to revenue growth. So if you look at a single point improvement in our CX index across, a broad swath of industries, you can get a sense for, just how much money is on the table if a company chooses to focus here and really commits the time and resources and training to getting this right. And just for a quick glimpse into how we see customer experience growing, is this a trend? Is this a flash in the pan? And I would point to these numbers in the growth of Chief Customer Officer and Chief Experience Officer roles to demonstrate that, where we see this kind of exponential growth just in a matter of 5 years, that this is a lasting trend. This is, again, part of a longer term business cycle. So customer experience really is here for the long term. And when we survey those chief customer officers, 48% of them will say that establishing a customer-centric culture through tools like training and coaching are a big part of their responsibilities. And what I'm showing you here is Forrester's competency model for customer experience management. So we have competencies that are critical to customer experience, like research. Do you understand your customers? Prioritization. Can you prioritize your CX improvement initiatives based on your understanding of what is most important to customers? Design, enablement, measurement, and culture, which is kind of the wrapper around all of them. And we illustrate it this way visually to underscore the fact that if you don't get culture right, you cannot possibly succeed in any of the other competencies. So I also want to point to enablement as a part of this visual, and literally enabling your employees to deliver the customer experience that your company intends. So it's not enough to simply say, we are in business to deliver value to customers or to create community, or kind of these abstract statements that when they land on employees' ears, they don't necessarily know how to act on them. And that's a lot of the focus of our conversation today. So let me just pause there and see what questions we might have, or questions that you might be getting on the chat, Charlie.
Yes, certainly. One question I have for you, Erin, is we know that design thinking is a very big trend as well in terms of a skill and an orientation that people want their organizations to have. What do you see as the overlap, if any, between design thinking and a focus on CX?
Well, design thinking is a tool. It's a way of training people to think and ask questions that can be really instrumental to just the way that employees approach problems. So it's, adopting design thinking as an approach, whether that's to experience design or to product design, is absolutely in line with what we would call, what we would define as being customer-centric, because it starts with an understanding of your customers' needs and validating those needs and iterating with the input of your customers. So it's not synonymous with customer experience. Those are, customer experience is a practice and a discipline that ultimately drives revenue growth. But design thinking is absolutely a valid and proven tool to add to your employees' toolkit.
I see. It sounds like a tool set that can be used in the service of customer experience initiatives and so forth.
Yeah, that's right. So it's very effective because it's easy to understand, and it's an adaptable approach that employees can use, not just in product design, because that may very well not be their day-to-day job, but it just teaches them a way to think about empathy first and really trying to understand the perspective of the user that they might be solving a problem for.
Sure. And then 2 more questions for you, Erin. One is, you talked about the rise of the CX officer and how more and more organizations are having them. Where do they normally fit into the organizational structure? How are they related to other departments in these organizations?
Yeah, well, if it's a C-level role, and maybe some folks on the line can appreciate this or relate to this in their own organizations, then typically they're part of the executive suite. They're part of the company's operating team. In other cases, they might have combined responsibilities. So if it's a chief customer and operating officer, obviously they have operational responsibilities that might include, operating the call center. We also see often that customer experience responsibility aligns with marketing. So it's not at all uncommon for a CMO to have responsibility for customer experience. And that's actually, a role that will sometimes get handed that responsibility without a lot of prior experience. And so at Forrester, we get a lot of questions from marketers who are new to customer experience roles and really seeking guidance for, where to begin.
Sure, that makes sense. I'm sure it varies by industry, and there's probably some trends there. So final question is, do you have some examples of things that you've seen where companies have made their customers feel empowered through their products and services? Do you have any specific examples that stand out in your mind?
That's an interesting way to phrase it. Empowering customers. We think of empowered customers as being a driving force behind what makes a focus on the customer and their needs so essential. So it's not necessarily that companies are doing the empowering, it's that customers are empowered by access to information, by access to choices that they didn't have, 2 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago. So that's how we typically, think of that phrase, empowered customers. We do talk a lot about empowering employees so that, if you have frontline employees who are and that your customers' expectations are that they want their problem solved, the first time, then you have to have employees who are trained, empowered, enabled with the right tools, the right information to solve that problem the first time. If that customer is going to say, yes, my interaction with this company met my expectations, and I am therefore more likely to recommend and to be a loyal customer myself.
That makes sense. Thank you, Erin. I have a feeling you'll talk more next about how you can help empower employees further.
Yeah, so I'll point to a couple of specific examples of the guidance that companies have created to enable employees to act. So just quickly to talk about, the ingredients of a successful customer experience transformation, it requires that company-wide culture shift. And that requires a certain level of alignment. So is everyone able to speak the same language? Does everyone have a common working definition of what it even means to be customer-centric? Are you able to connect silos so that everyone is working toward common goals with a shared mindset? And design thinking would be one of those tools that companies use to kind of establish that shared mindset, that common way of thinking. And then lastly, are you able to actually instill a common understanding of what your CX vision is? And companies that we work with, are at all different stages of maturity in terms of defining what their vision is. It is effectively the internal articulation of what your brand is promising to the marketplace. So this is the statement of that promise that is employee facing and that is intended to mobilize them, to galvanize them, to inspire them to act, and again, in a prescriptive way, which I'll talk about in just a second. So I mentioned this just a little bit earlier in our conversation, but the big disconnect that we hear about and observe in our research is that employees, by and large, show up to work, feeling that they are already customer-centric. And so when you give them a broad instruction about being customer-centric, they kind of tuck that away and say, yes, I'll just keep doing what I'm doing. Because people really do show up to work with good intentions. They're optimistic by nature. They kind of gravitate toward this message that, yes, we are focusing on the customer and that is a good thing. And they want to have that purpose in their work. But how to do that actually is confusing to people unless you give them specific guidance. So you can see here in some of our polling that you can see that people are a little bit unsure about, how their fundamental belief that this is the right thing to do connects to their understanding of what they need to do to actually make it happen. So this is where learning comes in, as we described it, that critical lever to establishing a customer-centric culture, because so much of it is about instructing on what certain things mean when you talk about them in your organization and making sure that everyone understands what it means to deliver on your customers' expectations. So not generically, what do customers want as a block, because there's no such thing. It's your customers and what they expect of your brand. That's what they need to be taught to do, and they can't just get there intuitively on their own. And we do this, we see this done in a couple of ways that are really effective. So there's the education part and the role that they play. There's also kind of the reinforcement that surrounds that training and education through routines in the organization by celebrating accomplishments and milestones that align with your destination, and actually rewarding employees in ways that are directly aligned to the CX metrics that you want to drive. So I promised some examples, and here are just a few. HP, again, standing out as one that found training to be a key enabler in their CX transformation. Florida Blue Cross Blue Shield, that saw an immediate impact to their customer satisfaction scores by focusing on tools and training early in their CX transformation. And then Crow, which is a B2B accounting firm, actually saw a 25% increase in their key CX metric. And a lot of companies use Net Promoter, but there are others out there, of course, by focusing on employee enablement as a top initiative for the CX team. And I'll show you in a little bit more detail what Crow did that was so impressive. But one of the things to point to here is that, in addition to recognition, in addition to providing that training, they also help people learn by example by establishing a CX ambassadors program. And this is an opt-in program that has organically grown to over 70 members. And by having CX ambassadors who are themselves trained and great examples of what it means to be customer-centric in that very intentional way that aligns with Crow's CX vision, employees actually have a live example to observe and learn from in their business unit, in their region. So that has been a very effective approach for them that combines all of these different tactics. And if you look at the level of specificity that they provided in their guidance, this is right in line with what we advise our clients to do. CX training, again, can't be generic. It has to be specific and actionable. So if in Crow's customer research, they understand that customers want them to be exceptionally responsive. Well, what does that actually mean? So they actually worked with their employee stakeholders to co-create this set of guidelines that they then use to train employees, a broader group of employees, on what it means to be exceptionally responsive, to provide high quality deliverables, to demonstrate industry expertise. So giving people examples that they can then emulate and put into action. So let me just pause there once more and see if there are more questions that we can answer.
Great, thanks, Erin. One question I have for you is, how often do you see learning initiatives being a major part of CX initiatives? Is this some of the time, a lot of the time, most of the time?
I would say almost always, and to varying degrees of effectiveness. So sometimes it's because sometimes people make the mistake of stopping at an awareness campaign and don't follow all the way through with that level of specificity that I just showed. So sometimes that means that there can be a disconnect between particularly back office roles. So if you think about a customer experience ecosystem that's comprised of, the people who really obviously impact the customer. For example, somebody working in a call center or somebody working the floor of your retail store. But then there are also the people who indirectly impact the customer experience, either by creating the legal policies that make it easy or not to work with your company, or by creating the complicated billing statement that make it confusing for customers to do business with you. And they may not be making that connection to the impact that they have on what customers ultimately experience, because they don't see it. So it's not enough to say, we are focusing on the customer. You have to say, we're focusing on the customer. That means this for you in accounting. So kind of taking it to that next level so that everyone can make that direct connection.
So in making those connections and in helping employees with that, how much is learning and development as a function involved in some of these learning requirements or initiatives in your experience?
Yeah, I mean, in some of our strongest examples, learning and development are kind of co-equal partners to the customer experience team in really putting together a programmatic and comprehensive approach to getting people to adopt new mindsets and actually change behavior. So L&D, is often kind of the keeper of change management wisdom in the organization, and that can be a really valuable skill set to CX leaders who are, kind of by definition in the business of leading change. So I think that, very often L&D is at the table, and when they're not, it may be because this content, this training content, is not something that's well known or that's easy to find. And so, the reason that Forrester kind of came to be in this business was responding to that gap and responding to that demand from our client base. And, our CX leader clients will tell us that, they may have stopped first at L&D, but found that, they didn't have the capability to actually create this content in-house, at least not yet. And so that's where we have, we see kind of these partnerships forging where L&D is often helping to vet or help to identify viable content providers, and then helping to construct the surrounding program that brings that into the organization in an effective way.
Sure. And Erin, we're getting a few questions in here, so let me pass them on to you. One question is around siloed organizations. I know Forrester works with a number, quite a few large organizations with different business units, et cetera. Some of them have different cultures. What have you seen successful for helping to provide consistent, sort of a consistent CX perspective across companies that are deeply siloed?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's a common scenario. And some of the principles that kind of stem from design thinking in terms of taking an iterative approach, scoring quick wins and building on those and proliferating those successes. That really is what we see being really effective. So there's that as a tactic, and I think overarching that kind of the first step that is required in building a customer-centric culture is having clear executive buy-in and having them articulate a clear why. So if you don't have that executive leadership and buy-in, it makes everything else really difficult, if not impossible. Because you have to have that kind of North Star that everyone is kind of oriented toward. So that's probably
Sure.
step one. But then within those silos, being able to kind of raise up what we call bright spots, the things that are working, where people are having a positive impact on the customer, identifying those behaviors and replicating that across the organization helps to drive success.
Sure. And do you have any tips if an organization's implementing a CX initiative, and maybe it's starting with a group that is very highly customer facing, like a support group or a services group or a retail group perhaps, and then trying to incorporate that CX perspective across other departments in the organization. and raise awareness. Any specific tips on how to best sort of propagate that common perspective?
Yeah, I mean, one tactic that we see as being really effective is what we call co-creation. So actually involving the stakeholders from those other functions and departments, and helping them to make that connection between their role and what the customer experience is. Because it is true, you know, you may have people kind of on the outside looking at that customer support team, or that client facing team, and say, well, obviously that is important to them and not so much for me. But when you actually get people together, and not just to talk it through, but to actually show them, here are some of our clients, our customers' most important journeys. For example, opening a checking account, just to take an easy one. And here are all the departments and roles that influence key moments in that journey. And you're on this map, and you might not be the highest influencer, but you're a moderate influencer, or you have at least some influence. And let's talk about how and what you might do to actually change your behavior to deliver on this expectation that our customers have. So we have a lot of examples of companies that have actually led those workshops. The output that you saw from Crow is a direct output from an approach like that. That's been really effective.
Yeah, that was impressive with Crow. You could almost say it was an impressive crow's feat.
Yes, you could.
One other question for you, Erin. So, we obviously concepts and terminology matter. I mean, we had earlier questions about the word empowerment. Where is that used with respect to employees and customers and so on? In general, do you recommend that a company undergoing CX transformation sort of build their own learning with respect to how they want to talk about things and these concepts? Or is it better at this point just to buy it or obtain it from an outside source?
That's a really good question. I mean, I think that there are certainly things that a company ultimately wants to produce on their own. And it doesn't mean that they have to do it alone or without guidance, but I'm thinking of things like actually crafting that CX vision, that kind of guiding statement that is going to rally employees, or actually, creating personas or mapping their clients' journeys. I would say those things are kind of prerequisites for going out and training employees, because otherwise, what are you actually training them on? What we've done as a content provider is offer a solution that kind of takes our research-driven findings to establish some credibility and understanding, but we pair that with some of those artifacts that I mentioned, like the company's own personas, their own journey maps, their own CX vision statement, and the prescriptive behavioral guidance, so that those things paired together kind of convince employees that this is not just someone's opinion, this is actually proven to drive revenue growth. And that seems to be a powerful combination right now.
Yes, and it does make sense as well, Erin, that as CX becomes more and more of an established discipline, that there is a commonly set of agreed principles and vocabulary, even though there's obviously a lot of diversity. But there does start to be sort of an independent body of knowledge around these concepts, and it shouldn't just be left to however a particular organization happens to talk about these things. So that does seem like a shift that's happening. But I'd love to invite you to now talk about Forrester's approach, and I think people will be quite interested in what you guys have been doing.
Yeah, I mean, quickly, I can just point people to what we've adopted from our research and what we've seen be effective in these longer-term culture shifts that are necessary for CX transformation. And that starts with a focus on, the individual stakeholders, groups of stakeholders that each have a unique role to play in a transformation. So you can, and I'll just build this out here, but you can guess without my help that, the executive team has a very distinct and different role to play in a CX transformation than, your typical line manager, than your typical frontline or back office employee. And so the approach that we've adopted really focuses on understanding what each of these stakeholder groups needs and adapting our approach to learning accordingly. So for the executive team, many of you probably see this in your day-to-day work, that that's an audience that typically benefits from in-person, hands-on learning. And so in these cases, we offer executive alignment workshops. We need to get everyone on the same page. We need them to understand that they're going to be out in front of this for 2, 3, 4, possibly even 5 years if they want to see the returns from what they're investing in this transformation. And for the core CX team and the managers, so think of this as, the people who are actually doing the work of executing the CX strategy, but also collaborating on that work. So not just your CX team, if you have one of those, but also the people, anybody that you would include in designing a persona or mapping a customer journey. Those people really benefit from having a common lexicon and common toolkit. So for those folks, we recommend and have created an online certification program. It spans 8 weeks. It's very intensive, and it offers multiple levels of increasing levels of certification and knowledge so that they can do the work. And then for the general employee audience, we offer that training that I described that kind of combines, our research-based findings about customer experience and kind of what employees and customers have to gain by working and thinking differently with what a company is doing in terms of their CX vision, their customer journeys that they want people to focus on. So for just a quick tour of our certification program, and I'll build this out. So I mentioned that it's a program in 3 levels, and we co-created this with our customers to fill the gap of, I have people on my CX team who might not have come from a CX background, and so they were really vocal in asking us to kind of lend our know-how to helping them bring their teams up to speed, but also to spread that message. So again, we think of CX ambassadors or champions as another audience that needs training right alongside that group of core practitioners. And when we look at the broad employee audience, obviously the learning needs are very different. Where our certification programs are 8-week courses, our CX Essentials program is anywhere from 30 minutes to 2 hours of content, and we design that, working with our clients. And these are just some of the topic areas that we cover with them based on the needs of that particular company. So if they want to focus on what drives customer experience excellence in their industry, for their organization specifically, that's something we work with those companies to tailor into that micro-learning kind of video-based program. And this is where our partnership with NovoEd comes into play. So, the features of the learning experience we find really resonate with people and help to set this apart. For customer experience in particular, where you're trying to get people to adopt this mindset of, designing new and modern and helpful experiences, delivering the learning in a way that actually conforms to those expectations is really important for credibility with the audience that you're training. And so we find this to be a really effective approach to helping people not only learn the concepts, but actually apply them through this kind of platform. So we have just a few key takeaways and recommendations, and I know that we have no time left for questions on this front. So maybe rather than going through these point by point, Charlie, I'll just leave this here, and if there's any last question that we can address, we could do that now.
Erin, we do have some time. We're slated to end at the top of the hour, although we can always end early. But we do have time for you to.
No, but I won't rush anyone off the phone.
Sure.
So yeah, so we know that training for skill sets without the right culture is going to be a waste of time and resources. That's kind of the summary here, that you have to know what you're training people on and be prepared to give them that guidance for the training effort to be successful. And then making that training specific, actionable, putting it in the context, not just of the business outcomes. And we hear this from the employee audiences that we train. You know, it's great for the business if customer experience is going to grow the bottom line, but what is it doing for me in my role? So part of the message here is just making sure that you're emphasizing not just what's in it for the business, but what's in it for the employees as well. And then the last point is to try seeking out your CX leaders, if you haven't already, to understand what gaps they're coming up against. Very often we hear it's within their own teams where, again, you know, it's still rare that you would hire somebody who has direct CX experience. But to understand also where they're stuck in kind of spreading their message, in getting people to speak the same language. That is something that we hear time and time again, and I think, you know, why we've gotten so much traction with the solution that we have to offer, because those CX leaders are often feeling very relieved that they actually have access to something that can help amplify their message and make their jobs easier, especially when we know that, you know, CX teams, you know, for all the proliferation that we've seen, still are typically pretty small inside of large organizations. So that's something that you can, in an L&D role, be helping them to do. So I'll switch there to any remaining questions that we might have or that you might have in mind, Charlie.
Sure, absolutely. And it's been great, Erin, seeing how Forrester's really taken up the mantle and has developed these CX certifications. I am curious, what has the reaction been to the CX certifications, and what is it supposed to? What does that certification signify to others?
Yeah, that's a great question and a valid one. I mean, I think you know, it's kind of an audacious undertaking to say we are going to establish a certification, and you know, we're drawing on kind of every ounce of credibility and authority we have in that space to do that. But because we have been in the CX thought leadership space for about 20 years now, believe it or not, you know, that is something that we have kind of brand permission to do. And as a result, you know, in the year that we've been offering this, we have over 1,200 individuals who have participated and been certified. So, you know, the significance that we see people gravitating toward is not only the fact that they need this knowledge, they need it to do their jobs more effectively, but also the fact that there is this craving for professional recognition and professional distinction among customer experience practitioners. I think, you know, CX is one of those disciplines that can sometimes fall victim to a perception that, you know, oh, I'm a customer, I could do this, I fundamentally understand customer experience. But we know, and these practitioners know, that CX is actually a very specific business discipline. There's science to it. There's a lot of leadership and change management involved, and that's a specialized skill set that people, I think, rightfully want to see recognized, and that's what we've been busy trying to do.
That's excellent. Thank you. Another question was asked around how long it takes to design curriculum, and maybe broadly speaking, you know, for various CX training initiatives that you've seen. Do you have a sense of time frame as to how long it takes to create that kind of curriculum that serves the CX training needs?
I think there's a lot of variability there in that question. I can answer it from our vantage point. If you think about, let's take our level 1 CX certification course, our CX Foundations course, is about, it's anywhere from 12 to 18 hours of learning, depending on how, you know, how quickly people move through it. And to build that probably takes a Forrester team, you know, anywhere between 100 to 150 hours is just a rough estimate. And that is, you know, I wouldn't extrapolate that to a team doing this on its own, because of course, we're building that based on research that we've already published. So in effect, the structure and the objectives are already there. To go out and source that for something of that scale and scope would probably take a fair amount of time. That's not to say that it's impossible to do, just that, that's where for people who are seeking that level of depth and rigor, they see some appeal in kind of looking for something that is credible off the shelf. So, in conversations that we have where we're talking with CX leaders and their L&D counterparts, often the L&D counterparts will say, theoretically, this is something that we can build, but it will take time, and sometimes that's not as fast as the CX leader wants to move, as I'm sure you've all experienced.
All right, great. And then a final question for you, Erin, and that is, with all the different types of learning that are associated with CX transformations, whether that's awareness or behaviors or particular skills, what have you noticed to be the most challenging type of thing to learn, or the hardest thing to convey in training?
Well, that's a really great question. I mean, I think the hardest thing to convey in terms of people being able to kind of have a consensus and move forward is probably around people establishing their CX vision. So it's what is the hardest thing for people to do in this environment? We teach a lesson in crafting a CX vision, not because it's everybody's job. It's actually probably only a very few people's job inside the organization to do that work, but it's vital that everybody understands the connection between the company's brand and what you're actually instructing employees to do. So that one is always, it's a very important lesson to people. They value that lesson, and it's very hard work for them because it just involves a lot of nuance of words and meaning, and to actually build consensus around that and get it adopted and ratified internally is a challenge that they often find very daunting, and they ask us a lot of questions around. So I would point there as a place that we end up spending a lot of time with our learners to make sure that they understand that fundamental concept before they can move forward.
All right, that makes sense. Thank you, Erin. And if you can move to our final slide, I'll say a few closing words for to wrap up the webinar. I'd like to thank everyone for attending today. I would like to thank you, Erin, for sharing your knowledge and your experiences. You can see here, we'd like to invite anyone to contact us, send us an email if you have any questions. If you have any questions about the topic that Erin talked about, feel free to reach out to her, or if you have any questions about Forrester certification products. If you have any questions about the NovoEd platform, feel free to reach out to me. One reminder for those who are interested, we do have a product tour where you can see the NovoEd product in action. And that's on Thursday, October 31st. There's a link to register for that.